As far as geopolitics globally are concerned, we are dealing with these two triads. One triad is basically India, China, and the US. And the other triad is India, China, and Russia. Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host, and today I'm going to talk to you about the geopolitical and diplomatic significance of Dr. Jaishankar's visit to Moscow. He's there. He's visiting Russia for 5 days. He's in Moscow, St. Petersburg. He's met with President Putin. He's met with his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, and he's also visited St. Petersburg University, where he's met a bunch of Indian scholars, Indologists, as they are now called. Today, I want to talk about the significance of this trip, especially given the fact that there is a lack of an asymmetry in diplomacy, which is that President Putin himself met in a very significant way with a foreign minister of another country. Usually, these things are done on a equal rank level. So in many ways, it's a very interesting diplomatic departure. It signals how seriously Russia is taking India and how much significance Putin himself personally is attaching to this sudden enhancement in India-Russia relations. Of course, the Indian foreign minister will say, of course, there's no change. This has always been like this. But that is not the case. There was an increasing amount of diplomatic distance between India and Russia in the past 2 years as India pursued a more strategic partnership with the US through the Quad and through the Indo-Pacific strategy, and with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, Biden's visit for the G20 summit, where Mr. Putin was not there. So until very recently, India's diplomacy and all the highlights of India's diplomacy were the strategic, shall we say, convergence of India and the West. The Prime Minister of Italy, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, all of these people coming to India. Macron is coming here on January 26th in place of Joe Biden, who declined to come. So the story of India's diplomacy for the last 2 years was about India's rise as a prominent player on world politics and the growing strategic partnership between India and Western countries. But suddenly now Russia is back in play. Russia is back in play. Putin is back in play. And suddenly we are not talking about the great friendship that India and Russia have always enjoyed. So as I unpack the diplomacy behind this, the logic, the strategic thinking, please, if you have not already subscribed to Khanversations already, please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, press the bell icon. Don't forget to share this with your friends and your colleagues, and also think of supporting Khanversations by joining it and becoming a member of Khanversations. So the first thing, which is very important, is that India is sending a message to Washington via Moscow. So basically, Dr. Jaishankar is, while he's in Moscow, while he's talking about India-Russia relations, India-Russia projects, etc., what he's basically telling the West is that you can't push India around. So after the rise of this so-called dispute between India and first Canada and then India and the US on the Khalistan separatist movement and their activities here in the US and Canada, and then the allegations that Indian diplomats were involved in a hire for murder scheme, etc., there seemed to have been some cooling off between the United States and India in particular, Of course, the hostility, diplomatic hostility between Canada and India were there for all to see. But between the US and India, suddenly there seems to be a bit of a cooling off. Joe Biden was invited to India's 26th January Republic Day celebrations, and now he is not coming. On 27th of January, the annual Quad Summit was expected to happen, and then suddenly all the other partners, the Australian Prime Minister, the Japanese Prime Minister, also were not available. And since all the other three partners were not available, the Quad Summit has been postponed to later in the year 2024. And given the fact that the US elections will be in full swing, starting within a few months, and so will Indian elections, I don't see a major Quad Summit happening very soon. Probably we should expect it either in late summer or in the fall of 2024. But what it does is essentially increases the distance between the US and India and the Quad. And hopefully by then this issue with the Khalistan separatist movement, etc., will be resolved. But it did appear as if the US was putting a lot of pressure in India, sending the FBI director, sending the CIA director, sending the number 2 person in the National Security Council to go and engage with India. It looked as if there was a truckload of Americans coming to put pressure on India to do something about those allegations. And so India is now responding by saying, look, we will exercise our strategic autonomy. In the past 2 years, we have seen that India has moved a little away from Russia diplomatically. The annual summit between India's prime minister and the Russian president has not happened since the war began. And India, even though it has maintained neutrality, has not really supported Russia directly, even though there's so much talk about our best friends. India has not sold any weapons or provided any material support to Russia, except Iran, who has sold thousands of drones to Russia and also given Russia the license to manufacture some of the Iranian drones. No other country has really provided weapons as such to Russia to fight this war, unlike Ukraine, who's getting weapons and money and aid and intelligence from many Western countries. But India, along with China, by buying Russian oil against the pressures from the West, especially the United States, has continued to at least hold the Russian economy up. So one of the reasons why Russia has economically survived the shall we say the onslaught of sanctions and decoupling by Western countries is primarily because China and India have increased their purchase of Russian oil, which they are, albeit getting on a discount, on a huge discount at some point. But nevertheless, to give you an idea, before the war, India-Russia trade was around $8 to $9 billion a year. This year, it was $50 billion, as the Foreign Minister Jaishankar has repeated it in several occasions on his tour of Moscow, that the trade has hit $50 billion. But if you actually look at the breakup, India's exports to Russia are just about $3.2 billion, and Russia's exports to India are over $46 billion. But what is interesting is that not all of that is oil. It's probably $35 billion of that is oil. So India is buying lots of stuff from Russia other than oil. And that's why it's able to, in many ways, support Russia's energy sector as well as other aspects of Russian economy. And in this year, India-Russia trade reached $50 billion without any purchase of major weapons. I mean, the thing that worries the West, more especially the US, is India's heavy dependence on Russia for supply of weapons. India's military technology and weaponry is heavily based on Russian technology, and so they import a lot of weapons from Russia. But in 2022, there were no imports from Russia. Russia needs its own weapons for its war in Ukraine. So if we come back to a normal situation, where India continues to buy Russian oil and also begins to buy Russian weapons, then the trade could easily reach $100 billion, as Dr. Jaishankar has predicted. So in his trip, Dr. Jaishankar met with the president, Mr. Putin, and met with the foreign minister. But he also gave a very interesting talk to the Indian diaspora, and I recommend everybody who is interested in India-Russia relations, but more importantly, in the message that India is trying to send to Washington, D.C., to watch this lecture and this engagement of Dr. Jaishankar with the Indian diaspora. He makes a couple of interesting points. I mean, he does acknowledge that there is a need to shore up India's exports to Russia to have a more balanced trade, and actually recommends that one of the reasons why Russia is not importing enough from India is because he feels that Russian businesses do not know much about what else India has to offer, which is quite surprising if these are such great friends. Why don't the Russians know about what India has to offer? Nevertheless, Dr. Jaishankar encouraged the Indian diaspora to basically increase the knowledge of their Russian contacts and Russian friends about India and what they could potentially buy and import from India. But he made some geopolitical comments which are very, very interesting. Number one, he said that the only constant in international politics for the past few decades, I mean, he even suggests since 1950, is India-Russia relations. So he says everything has changed. Other countries' foreign policy changes. US-China relations have changed. All other things, but the only thing apparently that is constant is India-Russia relations. So this message which is not entirely true, as I pointed out, but it is a message to Washington saying that, look, we have not abandoned Russia entirely. I mean, this is one of the biggest goals of Washington, D.C., is to disconnect the military dependency between India and Russia. So that was an interesting point that he emphasized, that not everything else changes in international politics, but India-Russia relations do not change. Putin acknowledged that India's position with regards to the war in Ukraine. He acknowledged that the Prime Minister of India would like to resolve this peacefully, and he invited Prime Minister Modi to Russia so that they can resume their India-Russia annual summits, which they used to have in the past. Now, in the past few weeks or a few days, we have seen a lot of chatter in the diplomatic circles that it's quite possible that Putin is open to suggestions and ideas about a ceasefire with regards to Ukraine, and he's open to ideas and is willing to consider the possibility. So I'm speculating that if Prime Minister Modi does go to Moscow, then perhaps India would be in a very good position to play the role of peacemaker. And could India broker a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, something that Turkey had attempted in 2022, early 2022, and failed? But is it possible that India could succeed there? Because Russia is more or less open, and if the funding from the US especially for Ukraine does not come through because of the dysfunctionality of the US Congress and then election issues, then perhaps UK may be open to the idea of cutting its losses and accepting a ceasefire. Who knows? So that is one message I think that is possible to glean out of the diplomatic discussions, that it is possible that Putin may, given his trust and his liking for India, trust India to play this role. As far as geopolitics globally are concerned, we are dealing with these two triads. One triad is basically India, China, and the US. And the other triad is India, China, and Russia. So India's fear of Chinese aggression on its border is what has allowed Quad to move so rapidly, especially after the Galwan episode and the Doklam episode in 2017. Uh, India has been moving closer and rapidly closer to the US, and it suits the US Indo Pacific strategy. And so the US has really reached out to India. So the tension between India and China makes India more and more amenable to move closer and closer to the US and be part of the Quad. So, as far as India is concerned, it is India's geopolitics with China that is driving its engagement with the Quad. The other triad is India, Russia, and China. And there are two issues there. One, if India becomes completely embedded in the Quad, then India would be abandoning this triad of India, Russia, China, thereby making Russia and China as allies without India playing a role there. However, if Russia becomes weaker, more weaker as a result of the war in Ukraine, gets more isolated, then it is likely to become more and more dependent on China, especially if India is not there to support it. So India, I mean, if you look at the map of Eurasia, Russia and China are more closer to India, and India has to live with them, live with China as forever as its neighbor. So India cannot allow China to become so much more powerful that two nuclear powers within its neighborhood, which is Russia as well as Pakistan, become client states of China. So China dominating both Russian geopolitics and Pakistani geopolitics will force the US to become, force India to become completely dependent on the US. And that is not a happy situation for India. So India has to balance this. In order to balance China, it has to engage the US and diversify its defense and defense technology, but it cannot fully abandon Russia because abandoning Russia would be basically throwing Russia into the arms of China. So this trip of Dr. Jaishankar to Moscow essentially is also rebalancing the two triads by moving a little away from the US, not entirely, just a little away from the US. It gives hope to Russia that India is still out there as a potential partner. And Russia would also like to have India out there so that it can diversify its non-Western economic relations. And I'm sure the Russians do not want to entirely be dependent on China. And given the fact that they have had better relations with India over the decades, they probably would like to have greater dependency economically with India than China. But nevertheless, these two triads are at play, and I think they are critical. To talk about what really happened was, I'm not very sure whether there's anything really concrete that came out. Both countries talked about cooperation. They talked about Gaza, but no serious solution came up. They talked about a multipolar world. They talk about it every time they meet. But they did talk about joint production of weapons, and they use the word modern weapons. Surely we don't expect you to produce jointly medieval weapons or backwards. Yes, whatever the latest technologies is there available in Russia, that will be transferred to India. So fine. But the reason why they were using the word modern weapons, at least it tells me, is there is nothing specific on that. Otherwise, they would have said that we are going to cooperate and together we are going to build a fourth generation or a fifth generation jet fighter, something which is a high priority for India, or we will start, sharing technology to build other kinds of weapons. Because in principle they have agreed to renew their military cooperation, which means that it had been reduced in the near past. But they haven't actually pinned down specifically what those projects really are. There is, of course, the cooperation on nuclear issues. So Russia is going to be building or is in the process of building another nuclear reactor in India. which will probably be commissioned in 2027. It'll come into operation in 2027, just 3 years from now. When we talk about India-Russia relations and its strong friendship, one point to be noted is that Russia is the only country which has sold reactors to India. Even though the US signed a deal with India in 2008, which is 15 years ago, no major nuclear technology or project has been initiated by the US in India, but the Russians have sold India nuclear reactors, and the Russians have helped India in its space and nuclear technological development. There is no doubt about it over the decades. So in that sense, you could say this is Dr. Jaishankar's Ghar Wapsi to Moscow. India is renewing its relations with Russia, making it more prominent and diplomatically more visible. Basically, I think, to send a message to Washington saying that you cannot bully us, and I think that is a very, very smart move. I'm sure it will be noted in Washington, and I want to see what reaction comes from Washington D.C. There is coverage of this visit, but not as much as one would have expected. There is an article in the New York Times which talks about Dr. Jaishankar's visit to Russia in spite of Western pressure. But clearly, I can tell you that this visit is going to make a lot of people unhappy in Washington, D.C. And I'm eager to see how Washington responds. Will it respond by putting more pressure on India on the Khalistan issue, or will it back off? And we see them making further offers to India in terms of cooperation in critical technologies or something else, or fast forwarding the sale of the drone that was agreed upon, or the jet engines, the F414 that is being provided to Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. So we will see what that happens. But I think this was an interesting diplomatic development. Please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, press the bell icon, share it with your social network. I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.